Chapter 3772. Lin Danny smiled charmingly. Are you afraid? Yimubai lowered his head to look at the collar of his shirt, then looked back at her. He smiled faintly but didn't say anything. He was thinking, if Wen Yuan saw this, what kind of reaction would he have? He was looking forward to it, so he went home late at night after the red carpet and the cocktail party. Wen Yuan and Xiangnan were both asleep. He only went to check on Xiangnan before heading to Wen Yuan's bedroom. She slept in the gloom of the one-room apartment, as it had always been, and she whispered to him that she would not wait for him to come home. How could he not feel that she was deliberately treating him coldly? He stood in the doorway of her bedroom and watched in silence for a moment, but did not go in. He was a little tired today, and he didn't want to be bored anymore. Yimubai went straight to the bathroom. In the bathroom, he threw the shirt into the laundry basket. During the time they lived together, Wen Yuan had been the one to do the laundry. She didn't go to work, and she didn't like to let the servants touch her clothes. Furthermore, the servant didn't live with them. She was temporarily living in a house across the street. This was Wen Yuan's idea. Yimubai thought that this power was because Wen Yuan didn't want others to spy on their relationship. In other words, she wasn't used to being his wife, or she wasn't willing to be his wife. He snorted coldly in his heart. She might have been willing to be Yi Mulan's wife. She would have been happy being his wife, and it would have been a happy breakup. The more he thought about it, the more dissatisfied he became. He casually took off his shirt and threw it into the laundry basket. Then his gaze paused on the lipstick stain on his white shirt. After a while, he moved his gaze away, snorted coldly, and went to take a shower. In the shower he was visibly distracted, wondering what she would think when she saw his shirt. With that in mind, he showered for about 10 minutes before wiping his body with a towel. After walking out, she wrapped a towel around her waist and wiped her hair with one hand before walking back to her bedroom. He lay down, unable to fall asleep. He was always guessing what she was thinking. In the end, he simply covered his eyes with a pillow and tried not to think or look. Eventually, he fell asleep. He had something to do, so he left early in the morning, but he would come back at night. He wanted to see Wen Yuan's reaction. When Wen Yuan woke up early in the morning, it was already past 7. Library of Literature. Chapter 3773. But he didn't. Instead, he went home with a lip print. Was it because he didn't care, or was he trying to pry? But no matter which one it was, she admitted that she was disgusted. Did he want her to argue with him, or did he tacitly approve of his relationship with Lin Danny? That night, he said there was nothing. Was that how he said there was nothing? Wen Yuan looked at the shirt in her hands. A moment later, she threw the shirt into the trash can. Her face was a little dazed. Afterwards, she went about her business as if nothing had happened, But she felt very cold. This marriage was so cold, just like the coming winter. That night, Yimubai came home very late as usual. The first thing he did was to go to the laundry room. He also saw the shirt she had thrown into the trash can. He thought, she always cares about it, and she always feels uncomfortable. He waited for her to ask. However, he still did not receive a response from her the next day. They had breakfast together. She was indifferent and gentle. Of course, the indifference was directed at him, and the gentleness was directed at Xiangnan. Yimubai pursed his thin lips. There was a newspaper in his hand. It was a scandal between him and Lin Danny. He didn't want Xiangnan to see it, so he quietly closed the newspaper and said to Xiangnan, "Daddy is going out. Be good at home and listen to mommy, okay?" Xiangnan was especially obedient and nodded vigorously. At this moment, Yimubai calmly and naturally looked at Wen Yuan. Wen Yuan's head was lowered, so he couldn't see her expression. So he reached out to the table and said, "I'm leaving." She looked up and said yes. There would be no future. Yimubai left with a feeling of parting on bad terms. He was not a fool. He could feel her deliberate indifference. For the rest of the day, he thought about the meaning of their marriage. For the first time, he felt that he might have been wrong. He and Wen Yuan were not suitable for marriage. Her personality, her past, and even her marriage to his older brother. He thought about all kinds of things and couldn't help feeling a little heavy when he returned home at night. After taking a shower, he went straight to her bedroom. After pausing at the door for a moment, he walked directly to the bed, sat down, and reached out to touch her cheek. "Wen Yuan, let's talk." She slowly opened her eyes. Her gaze was clear, letting him know that she hadn't slept. And NBS. Literature Center. Chapter 3774. Also. She tried to calm herself down. A man who cheats is like money stained with shit. It's disgusting to pick it up. After she finished speaking, she looked at him calmly and got off the bed. "If you want to sleep here, I'll sleep in the guest room." She walked straight out, so fast that he couldn't catch her. When he wanted to find her, Wen Yuan had already entered the guest room and locked the door. Yimubai knocked on the door. "Wen Yuan, come out, let's talk." He tried to reason with her, but no woman was willing to reason with a man who had lipstick marks from another woman. Wen Yuan ignored him, but after a while, he heard a low cry outside. She was crying. Yimubai listened outside, and he couldn't describe the feeling in his heart. He had started to doubt his marriage, and he felt that they were not suitable for each other, but he felt annoyed when she cried. She didn't want to talk about it, and he was tired after a busy day. This matter was delayed, and no one mentioned it again. However, this matter was like burying a thread, causing their marriage to be in danger from all sides. Wen Yuan didn't mention it again, and neither did he. Lin Danny was still living in their world, or rather, in Yimubai's world. Wen Yuan didn't care, so Yimubai believed that she really didn't love him anymore. Even the basic feelings were gone. She only treated him as a fertility machine. He was a little annoyed, and he became more and more distant from her. Except for Xiangnan, there was almost no communication between them, but the atmosphere at home was still gentle. Only the two adults could understand the deliberate gentleness, and Xiangnan was too young to understand it. Her period came, and when it was time for her to be pregnant, Yimubai appeared in her bedroom. It had been 10 days since the last time they did it. She lay there quietly, letting him do it, but she didn't make a sound, and she didn't give him any reaction. She clenched her fists, bit her teeth, and endured. He hadn't done it for a few days, and he was a little rough. She wondered if feelings weren't important for a man, and just a look was enough. Because of her resistance, she was unable to fully immerse herself in it. It was obvious that she was just faking it. It was obvious that she was just using him as a reproductive tool. Yimubai becomes fierce and doesn't care about her feelings. Wen Yuan can't stand it anymore. She pushes against his shoulder and Yimubai whispers in her ear, "You don't want children anymore, huh? To you, am I not your reproductive tool?" He didn't let her go. In the end, he made her cry. Her voice was intermittent. "Once, will be enough." His thin lips moved to her ears and his voice was hoarse. "If I don't do more, how can I make you pregnant? Don't you just want to get pregnant?" Wen Yuan seemed to be in a daze. Then, she stopped resisting and let him do whatever he wanted. Later, she fainted and fell asleep. Yimubai stared into her eyes and ended hastily. The days were still very simple. He went back to the United States for 2 days, then rushed back to do it with her. During the 6 to 7 days of her pregnancy, he almost didn't fall behind. However, when Yuan was still not pregnant. Next month, her period arrived on time again. When Yuan looked at the smear of red, she was a little dazed and disappointed. She didn't get pregnant again. She remembered that time when she and Yimubai didn't use protection, and she got pregnant with Xiangnan in one night. In the past 2 months, she had done it countless times. Why didn't she get pregnant? Just as she was in a daze, the door of the washroom opened unexpectedly. It was Yimubai who appeared at the door. He saw it too. His pupils were a little deep. Then, he slowly closed the door and his tall and slender body leaned against the side of the washroom door. When Yuan looked down. "Can you go out? Let's talk." Yimubai looked at her quietly. He didn't avoid lighting a cigarette in front of her. When Yuan pursed her lips. "Wait for me outside. We'll talk in the study later." "Right here," he said a little forcefully. "It won't take long." When Yuan looked down. "Go ahead. Your period is over. Let's go to the hospital for a checkup." When Yuan, "I don't want my son to have a transplant. Do you understand what I mean? Now is not the time to be willful." His tone was a little strict. When Yuan blinked and then smiled lightly. "Willful? What right did she have to be willful? He said he wanted to have a child. She tolerated him flirting with other women. Was this willful?" She didn't know what Lin Danny's behavior was like when he knew he had a wife. Perhaps, he had double standards in his heart. That was why he was different. When Yuan felt a little cold in her heart. However, she said calmly, "Okay, I'll cooperate. Can you go out now?" "I remember now. You don't want to be a spectator," she said lightly. Of course, Yimubai wouldn't be a spectator. He leaned forward and got up. Then, he opened the door and went out. When Yuan was in a daze. She only got up after a long time. The blood loss had made her a little dizzy. She tried her best to hold it in, but in the end, she still fainted in the bathroom. With a loud bang, Yimubai frowned and immediately pulled the door open. 5 more chapters tomorrow. This book came from. Chapter 3775. The moment he opened the door, he saw that when Yuan had fainted in the bathroom. Yimubai immediately went forward to carry Wen Yuan and rushed out. Then, he thought of Xiangnan. In the living room, he placed Wen Yuan on the sofa and went next door to call the helper to look after Xiangnan. He then carried Wen Yuan downstairs and put her in the car. She fainted. He thought that apart from the physical discomfort, it was mostly due to the mental pressure. He frowned. Did he give her a lot of pressure? Yimubai started the car, his gaze cold in the night. There was a traffic jam on the way. When they were almost at the hospital, he opened the door and got out of the car, carrying her to the hospital in front. After running for 10 minutes, he sent her to the emergency room. The receptionist was an experienced gynecologist. After the examination, she looked at Yimubai. Does she have any other illnesses? Yimubai hesitated. Probably not. Probably. The gynecologist had always been the most difficult to deal with. At this moment, she looked at him with a surprised expression. Then, she asked, "You are husband and wife, right? Why don't you know this basic thing?" Yimubai's expression was a little unnatural. The doctor looked at him a few more times and then lowered her head to write. "Menstrual shock, it's nothing serious. She will be fine after resting. Oh, and don't be too stressed, otherwise, it won't be very comfortable. As a husband, you have to be considerate of your wife." Yimubai reached out to take it. He was about to leave, but he paused and coughed lightly. I want to ask. We want to have a child, but we haven't been pregnant for 2 months. Maybe she is a little stressed. The doctor looked at him in disbelief. Not getting pregnant for 2 months is already too stressed. If you don't let her get pregnant for 2 years, how can she live? Yi Mubai paused. We have to get pregnant next month. He calmly told her about Xiangnan's illness. The doctor's expression changed. Then, she thought for a moment and said, pay attention to the frequency. It's not easy to get pregnant if you have sex too often. She wrote out a prescription. Take this Chinese medicine back and make it for her. Although it's not effective, it can still increase the chances of getting pregnant if both of you are fine. Yi Mubai took the prescription to the pharmacy. When he went to the emergency room, Wen Yuan was already awake. She was sitting on the small bed in the emergency room, her hair down. Her face was still a little pale, but it was much better than before. Seeing Yi Mubai come in, her voice was hoarse. What happened to me? He carried the medicine bag and walked to her side. He reached out his hand and placed it on top of her head, as if he wanted to stroke her hair. However, after his hand stayed there for a long time, he hesitated. You, he said. He. And Xiangnan. Yi, he said, one at. I asked Auntie to take care of him, Yi Mubai said softly. Oh, Wen Yuan replied and sat up. Although she was still a little dizzy, she still wanted to go home immediately. Yi Mubai looked at her pretending to be fine. He stuffed the bag in his hand into her arms. I'll carry you. Yi Mubai looked at her pretending to be fine and stuffed the bag in his hand into her arms. I'll hold you. Wen Yuan bit her lip and shook her head. I can walk. Book from Chapter 3776. However, he had already carried her up and was walking straight to the door. It was only when he was out of the door that he remembered something. He picked up his phone and dialed his assistant's number to get him to deal with his car that was parked on the road while he took a taxi to take Wen Yuan home. Of course, the taxi wasn't as comfortable as his car and Wen Yuan was weak, so she was forced to lean on his shoulder. His shoulders were wide and suitable for Asian women to lean on. Wen Yuan's cheek rested on his shoulder and she could see the side of his face and his sexy Adam's apple from where she was. She pursed her lips and looked at him silently. In the past, this was a distant dream of hers. But now, to her, it was within reach, yet it was even further away. She lowered her eyes, not wanting to look at him anymore. Sometimes, it would make her sad if she looked too much. They were in a marriage, yet they were as strangers as they were in the past. As for him, he held on to her shoulder and kept looking in the direction in front. Then, his phone rang. It was especially abrupt in such a quiet space. Yi Mubai was still holding on to her as he picked up his phone with the other hand. It was a call from Lin Danny. He froze for a moment and wanted to hang up. At this moment, Wen Yuan said faintly, "Answer the phone." With that said, she broke free from his embrace and leaned against the other side before looking out of the car. Yi Mubai glanced at her before hanging up. But then, there was dead silence in the car. Instead, the driver in the front laughed. "Young lady, you can't be so generous. Men nowadays are all fickle, especially when your husband is so handsome. It's not wrong to keep a close eye on him. How can you push him to someone else? This won't do. You must be from outside, right? The women in H City are very good at dealing with their husbands. They are very resourceful. You have to learn from them." Wen Yuan bit her phone and forced out a smile uncomfortably. Yi Mubai looked at her and said nothing. Later, when they reached the apartment, she didn't talk about Lin Danny either. Yimubai carried her to the bedroom and she wanted to get up. He reached out to hold her and said in a displeased tone, "How much longer are you going to be willful? I'm going to boil the medicine." Her expression was a little strange as she paused for a moment. "I want to go to the bathroom to change. I've had too much for the first 2 days." Only then did he understand. He stared at her for a long time, his eyes burning with passion. When Yuan suspected that he was a pervert. Earlier, when she was in the bathroom, he had been lazing around. Now that she said she was going to change, he was looking at her with such a gaze. Did he like to see red, or did he like to have his private parts broken? Her mind was in a mess as she slowly got out of bed and walked to the bathroom. When she came out, her face was pale because she had lost too much blood. When she opened the door, she saw Yimubai standing at the door with one hand in his pocket. He said indifferently, "I asked the auntie to make you a tonic. I'll ask her to bring it to you later." When Yuan didn't say anything and just slowly returned to his bedroom. He wanted to follow, but he soon saw Xiangnan. He frowned and brought the little fellow to the living room outside, letting him sit and play. Yimubai squatted down and said in a hoarse voice, "Let mommy rest, okay?" Xiangnan looked at him thoughtfully. "What's wrong with mommy?" Yimubai reached out and rubbed Xiangnan's little head. He said softly, "Mommy is just tired. Let her rest, okay?" He wanted to leave and return Lin Danny's call. However, Xiangnan reached out and tugged at his hand, saying softly, "Daddy." Book from Chapter 3777. He turned around and looked at Xiangnan. Xiangnan's little face had a faint blush. He didn't know if it was because of shyness. He asked softly, "Daddy, will you be with another auntie?" Yimubai's expression froze. Then, he turned around and looked in the direction of Wen Yuan's bedroom. He asked softly, "Did mommy tell you that?" Xiangnan shook his head. "No, I saw it on TV." Yimubai sighed in his heart. He leaned over and pressed his forehead against Xiangnan's. He said hoarsely, "No, Daddy won't leave Xiangnan." Xiangnan pressed against him. Such a young child wasn't easy to fool. After a long time, such a long time of warmth, Xiangnan finally broke free and said softly but firmly, "Daddy, if one day you get together with other aunties, I want to be with mommy. The baby in mommy's tummy is the same." Yimubai was a little surprised. He looked at Xiangnan and didn't say anything for a long time. He wanted Xiangnan to speak again, but the little guy didn't want to say anything anymore. Yimubai reached out and patted his head. Then, he went to the study. He was smoking in the study with his phone in his hand. He had wanted to call Lin Danny, but he hesitated. His relationship with Lin Danny was just like how it was on the surface. She was just like the countless women who admired him, just like Wen Yuan in the past. The only difference was that he had only slept with Wen Yuan. Of course, Wen Yuan wasn't the only woman he had. But he had never touched Lin Danny. He didn't push her out of his life. Just as Wen Yuan had said, Lin Danny's personality was very similar to Lin Cece's. They looked alike too. He slowly puffed out smoke rings. Finally, he dialed Lin Danny's number. She drank too much and seemed to be crying. She kept talking and crying, saying that he didn't want to accompany her. Yimubai listened quietly. He didn't hate Lin Danny. When a man couldn't get the woman he wanted, the substitute would become cute. Moreover, he didn't need to be careful with her. This was probably the deep-rooted bad habit of many men. After a long time, Yimubai said, "Danny, you should have grown up." Actually, he knew that she had gone to look for Wen Yuan. She had done all sorts of things on purpose, but he had indulged her. Other than testing Wen Yuan, he had also indulged Lin Danny a little. Otherwise, how could a girl be so arrogant? Lin Danny was not a fool. She knew it very well. That was why their ambiguity had fermented into what it was today. But she was not satisfied. She wanted him. She wanted all of him. She drank a little too much and her words were murmuring to herself, "Mubai, I miss you very much. Can you come and accompany me?" Yi Mubai looked down, "Drink less." With that, he hung up the phone. He would not let a young girl control him. He treated her as a substitute for Lin Cece. He spoiled her a little, but not to that extent. After hanging up, he smoked a few more cigarettes and walked out. It just so happened to be mealtime. When he went out, Xiang Nan was sitting upright in his chair. Yi Mubai went over and sat down. He looked at Xiangnan. "Where's Mummy?" Xiangnan lowered his head and said in a low voice, "Mummy is still sleeping. She said she doesn't want to eat." Yi Mubai looked up and asked the auntie at home, "Did Madam eat the supplements that were brought over just now?" Chapter 3778. She heard him on the phone. However, the housekeeper still answered seriously, "It's like this. Madam seemed to want to talk to the second young master after dinner. When she came to the study, she saw that the second young master was on the phone, so she didn't disturb him. Then, she went to bed and said that she wouldn't be eating." Yi Mubai's expression immediately changed. "She went to the study." The housekeeper nodded. "Yes." Madam stood at the door for a while and left. At this moment, the housekeeper felt a little uneasy. She said softly, "Sir, did Madam hear something?" Yi Mubai glanced at her. She immediately understood that she had crossed the line and didn't dare to speak again. Yi Mubai took care of Xiangnan's meal and then stayed with him for a while. However, the little Xiangnan noticed that he was absent-minded. He played with the building blocks and said softly, "Daddy, if you want to see Mommy, you can go. I'm fine by myself." Yi Mubai coughed lightly. "How did you know?" "Because you looked at the time 5 times just now," Xiangnan said. Yi Mubai thought about what he had said before. He thought that this child was actually very similar to himself. From the looks of it, Xiangnan was reflected in him, and he was reflected in Wen Yuan. He thought about it in his heart. There was an indescribable feeling in his heart, but he still got up and patted his son's head. "I'll go see Mommy." Yi Mubai originally thought that Xiangnan didn't care too much about a complete family. However, when he got up and was about to leave, the little person stopped him. "Daddy." He looked at the small, soft person. Xiangnan's little face had a touch of shyness, and his voice was also very soft. "Daddy, I want you to be with Mommy." Yi Mubai looked at Xiangnan and suddenly felt that he was a little cruel to this child. He wanted to maintain his marriage with Wen Yuan, but at the same time, he didn't completely reject Lin Danny. He actually made a mistake that many men in the world would make. Apart from not sleeping with her, he did everything else. Of course, it wasn't like he didn't have women when he was in America. Yi Mubai's mood was a little complicated. He needed to think about it. He went to Wen Yuan's bedroom. Wen Yuan was lying on her side, her body slightly moving up and down. He knew that she was not asleep, so he walked over and sat on the bed behind her. He paused for a moment and reached out to touch her back. "Get up and eat before you sleep." She didn't say anything, so he patted her again. "Wen Yuan, I know you're awake. Let's talk." She said, "Talk about what? Is it Lin Danny?" Her voice was a little tired. "I won't stop you." I don't care if you want to mess around with her in marriage or divorce and give her a title. Just don't let Xiangnan come into contact with these things too early, okay? Yimubai, I beg you to be a father with warmth. There was a hint of anger in Yimubai's voice. In your eyes, am I such a man? When Yuan didn't respond, she just sat up slowly. Her face was pale. She reached out and wrapped her blanket around herself, as if that would give her a sense of security. After a long time, she raised her eyes and looked at him. Her lips moved. Isn't that what you did? His eyes narrowed dangerously. When Yuan. Nothing happened between me and Lin Danny. He said this because he really didn't have sex. Maybe they had kissed a few times, and they almost had sex. But in the end, he stopped because it was after marriage, and he didn't want to be too much of a jerk. End of this chapter. Chapter 3779. Chapter 3779. Warshi heard him on the phone. If one day he wanted to be with Lin Danny, he would cut off all ties with Wen Yuan. However, he didn't expect that just as he told Wen Yuan that it was nothing, Lin Danny, who was on the other end of the line, got drunk. Because he had hung up and turned off his phone, her imagination ran wild. She wasn't willing to give up and released a video to the media. It was the passionate kiss between her and Yimu Bai in the elevator. As Yimu Bai was speaking, his phone rang. It was his assistant calling. His tone was very urgent. Director Yi, the situation now is very tricky. The thing that Miss Lin Danny released. I'll send it to you. Yimu Bai frowned and immediately walked out. Standing in the hallway, he lowered his head and received the message. It wasn't edited. It really existed. He knew it. After watching quietly for a while, he left the room and dialed his assistant's number. No matter how much it costs, deal with it. He didn't want Wen Yuan to see it. The assistant hesitated for a moment and asked, Director Yi, are you sure? Yes. His voice was indifferent. Go do it. After saying that, he wanted to walk back to the bedroom, but Wen Yuan stood at the door with a calm gaze. But inside, there was clearly disillusionment. She looked at him calmly. After a long time, she smiled faintly and retreated. Close the door. Yimu Bai looked at her, his gaze slightly tense. He knew that she had seen it. Her gaze was full of mockery, as if she was saying that nothing had happened just a second ago, and in the next second, such a thing had happened. Just like the lipstick mark incident that night, when Yuan dealt with it coldly. She didn't make a scene with him. She just didn't want to bother with him. He opened the door and went in. She didn't lock the door, probably because she didn't want to affect Xiangnan. He walked in quietly and stood by the bed. He thought for a moment and said, I only kissed her. Nothing else. When Yuan lay with his back to him. After a long time, he asked, Are you explaining, or are you giving me a guarantee? In fact, Yimu Bai doesn't need it. You just need to protect Xiangnan. He's too young and his heart is too fragile. I don't want him to know these things. As for the rest, you can do as you wish. The look in his eyes became dangerous, and his voice was tense. Then you don't care, do you? When Yuan chuckled bitterly and self-deprecatingly. What's the point of me caring? Yimu Bai, haven't you ever thought of divorcing me and being with Lin Danny? She slowly sat up and looked at him under the crystal light. Are you sure you didn't? Yimu Bai could not deny it. The atmosphere was tense. Yimu Bai, really, you don't have to worry about it. To me, this isn't a betrayal. He stared at her, and at this moment, he realized that this woman's heart was as still as water. Yimu Bai didn't explain anymore. He didn't tell her that when everything happened, he instinctively chose to keep their marriage. Unfortunately, in Wen Yuan's heart, their marriage never existed. Her feelings for him had completely disappeared when he came home with Lin Danny's lipstick mark. They were just strangers living in the same house. They just had a common son. They just needed to have another son. It was just like that, nothing more. Yi Mubai also smiled sadly. Yes, you're actually quite right. She looked up, and her face was full of brilliance. It actually hurt his eyes. End of this chapter. Chapter 3780. Translator, King Bao. Editor, Dark Gem. He left and returned to the study. His phone rang again. This time, it was Lin Danny. His phone rang again. This time, it was Lin Danny's call. Yi Mubai hesitated for a moment, but he still picked it up. When he picked up the phone, the voice on the other end was weak. Mubai, are you angry at me? Do you not want to talk to me anymore? He could tell that something was wrong. His voice was tense. Where are you? Lin Danny chuckled. In the hotel bathroom. The water is very red. Mubai, my whole body is relaxed now. I feel very comfortable and I'm enjoying it. Yi Mubai held his phone and walked out. He started the car while talking to her. As he drove, he saw Wen Yuan on the balcony in the rearview mirror. Under the night sky, her hair was let down and she was only wearing a thin nightgown. She stood there and looked at him, just like how she had seen him and Lin Danny hugging that night. He clenched his fists. For a moment, he wanted to stop. He wanted to ignore Lin Danny's life and go back to tell Wen Yuan that no matter what happened to this marriage, they could continue living like this. There was nothing wrong with that. At least, they were quite harmonious when it came to sex. But in the end, he didn't. In a sense, if he hadn't given Lin Danny that kind of hope, she wouldn't have come to this. However, when he rushed to the hotel and knocked on the door, he was greeted by the image of Lin Danny coming out of the shower and countless reporters. It was a news release that couldn't be suppressed. Are you surprised? Lin Danny hugged his neck. She had the scent of rose essence on her body. To be honest, it was very tempting. Most men wouldn't be able to resist it. Moreover, she was really a beautiful girl with a good family background. Which man could resist her throwing herself at him? However, she had met Yi Mubai, the Yi Mubai who was used to seeing women. At this moment, facing such an extreme temptation, he was reminded of Wen Yuan's beauty on the balcony. He regretted it instead. He reached out, wanting to push Lin Danny away, but she hugged him like an octopus. She murmured, Mubai, don't you want to get rid of her? You can make her back off now and let her know that you love me. Yi Mubai's expression was a little ugly. After a long time, he pushed Lin Danny away and said in a very low voice, I don't love you. I'm sorry. He looked at her with a complicated gaze and also a little disappointed. He still walked back resolutely. The reporters were desperately taking pictures of the romantic affairs of the former best actor and the current night director. His target was still Lin Danny. Everything that had happened before was just groundless accusations. The few things that happened today were the real deal. Firstly, it was the kissing gate. Secondly, it was the truth. Director Yi came over in the middle of the night. However, it was obvious that he didn't like Lin Danny's actions and wanted to leave on bad terms. At this time, there was no way to do public relations. Yi Mubai left immediately. Lin Danny laughed coldly. Then, she said softly behind him, Yi Mubai, you've fallen in love with her, haven't you? Her voice became louder. Are you crazy? She's your ex-sister-in-law. Are you going to be together with your big brother's woman? Yi Mubai was stunned. He clenched his fists. He had always thought that the willful Wen Yuan was the limit of his tolerance. However, there was still a woman who exceeded his expectations today. He had even liked this girl a lot. He liked her willfulness and her looks. However, at this moment, she was very vicious. Chapter 3781. He turned his head and looked at Lin Danny. Lin Danny's face was filled with madness, completely different from the sweetness from before. She had a cold smile on her face. We can't go back, right? So you want to destroy it, right? He asked calmly. She said yes and laughed so hard that her body was shaking. She didn't care about the gazes and cameras of the reporters. She danced barefoot ballet in the corridor, saying that her ballet was his favorite in the past. Yimubai watched calmly as she went crazy. In the end, he still left. Before he left, he looked at the reporters. My wife's name is Wen Yuan. If anyone writes a word of it, I'll make his company disappear tomorrow. Wen Yuan. Everyone was silent because that was Chief Ye's wife, Yimubai's ex-sister-in-law. Lin Danny was actually telling the truth. With that, Yimubai left. Lin Danny pounced over and hugged his waist from behind, sobbing softly. Mubai, it's my fault. I drank too much. Can you forgive me? He pulled her out from behind and pressed his hands on her shoulders. After a long time, he said calmly, Lin Danny, I won't see you alone in the future. Perhaps something had really happened between them, but he couldn't seem to stand strong emotions. He didn't like women clinging to him, be it Wen Yuan in the past or Lin Danny now. Yimubai left without any reluctance. Lin Danny stood in the corridor and said hoarsely, Yimubai, I really love you. He didn't stay for a second and left directly. Yimubai sat in the car, feeling a little annoyed. He knew that no one dared to write about Wen Yuan, but there were many ways for it to spread. Besides, he couldn't wash away the matter between him and Lin Danny. But it wasn't clean either. He smoked a few cigarettes before starting the car. He had just returned to the condominium, and before he got out of the car, Yi Mulin called. He scolded him. Yimubai listened lazily. The relationship between the two brothers was very good. Of course, they wouldn't fight because of this. However, he still had to listen to Yi Mulin for some things because his legs were thick. After hanging up the phone, he saw that he had been bombarded for half an hour. He didn't really care, but when he was about to return to his apartment, his heart was still heavy. He had never thought of being a loving couple with Wen Yuan, but when Lin Danny made a big fuss, as a husband, he felt very sorry for Wen Yuan. After all, Wen Yuan was a very low-key person, and their previous identities were very special. He got out of the car, closed the door, and walked up the stairs. It was late at night. He opened the door. It was dark everywhere. Only Wen Yuan's bedroom was lit. He stood in the doorway, his tall frame elongated in the light. Wen Yuan sat on the bed and looked up at him. He stared back at her, but at that moment, neither of them knew what to say. After a long time, he said in a hoarse voice, It's completely over. Do you think so? Wen Yuan lowered his eyes. You probably don't know how crazy a person can be when they are infatuated with someone. Yimubai still stood there and looked at her quietly. After a long time, he said in a low voice, What about you, Wen Yuan? Is your infatuation still there? She smiled faintly and lowered her eyes. Probably not anymore. At that moment, he saw disillusionment in her eyes again. Chapter 3782. She heard him on the phone. He stood there for a long time. When Yuan said softly, Go and see Xiangnan. It wouldn't be peaceful for the next few days. She didn't feel wronged, but she felt that it was unfair to Xiangnan. Yimubai looked at her for a long time before leaving. He went to see Xiangnan. The little guy was sleeping soundly and looked carefree. Yimubai suddenly felt like a loving father. He thought that no matter what happened between him and Wen Yuan, he should treat this child well. Moreover, after he and Wen Yuan got married, his relationship with Lin Danny was like revenge against Wen Yuan. In the end, it wasn't Wen Yuan who was hurt, but himself. Because he realized that the person he cared about the most was himself. Yimubai closed his eyes, let out a long sigh, and walked out slowly. That night, he didn't sleep at all. He thought a lot. Later, he understood some things. Early in the morning, what happened last night was like a butterfly effect. Because of Yi Mulin, Lin Danny's family didn't dare to say anything, but Lin Danny was admitted to the hospital. Because of suicide. Wrist slit. It was an uproar. Wen Yuan's apartment was surrounded and it was almost impossible to move. Xiangnan couldn't even go to the hospital. Yimubai made a decision to return to B City. Wen Yuan was against it. She stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling window in the study and said calmly, "I don't want to go back to B City." Yimubai was a little annoyed. Otherwise, he wouldn't have smoked in front of her. His voice was a little indifferent. "Look at the reporters below. Do you think you can live here peacefully? What about B City? Do you think you can?" Wen Yuan turned around. He looked at her and said in a low voice, "Come to America with me, Wen Yuan. No one knows you there." What he didn't say was that he didn't want others to criticize her and say that she was. Also, he didn't want her to face his family. Wen Yuan looked down and didn't say anything else. Therefore, the trip to the United States was put on the agenda, and they would leave in about a week. Yimubai contacted a doctor in the U.S. for Xiangnan, and the medical records here were also sent over. After everything was prepared, they would leave H City a week later. They would stay in B City for 2 days before going to the U.S. Wen Yuan also began to pack her luggage. She was a little worried when she was packing. She had thought that she would settle down in H City for a long time and that she would not go to America with him. However, they still had to go together. As for what happened between him and Lin Danny, she didn't ask about it. It was probably not going to end well. Wen Yuan's mind wandered for a long time before he continued packing up the things in his hands. Yimubai walked into the changing room and looked at her. His voice was a little faint. "What are you thinking about?" "No, it's just that. I feel like I've only lived here for a month or 2. It was rare for her to have such a long conversation with him these days. "I quite like H City." He squatted down and looked at her. "What you don't like is someone or something, right?" "Not really." She smiled indifferently. "Actually, regarding Xiangnan's matter, I have a favor to ask of you. I'm not that unreasonable." She wanted to continue packing, but he reached out and grabbed her. His voice was extremely hoarse. "Wen Yuan, I admit that I was ridiculous for a while, after I lost my memory." She pulled her hand away. "What do you mean by saying all this?" He frowned. "What I mean is that we can be an ordinary couple, just like everyone else." End of this chapter. Chapter 3783. She did not love him. 1. Wen Yuan smiled. "I didn't say it's not possible. It's pretty good now." "Pretty good." He chewed on the word. She probably had such low expectations because she didn't have much hope. This time, the matter had become so big, but she didn't cry or make a fuss. She just let it develop. was just as she said, she was no longer infatuated. Yimubai didn't say anything more. He walked to the balcony and smoked for a long time. In the evening, he went out to deal with some matters. At 8:00 in the evening, when Yuan took care of Xiangnan and was about to take a shower when her phone rang. It was an unknown number. When Yuan quietly looked at it for a while, but still pressed the button to accept it. On the other side, it was Lin Danny. Lin Danny was completely different from her previous arrogance. Her voice was very soft. "Miss Wen, can we meet?" When Yuan held the phone and said calmly, "Is there a need for us to meet?" Lin Danny's voice was very urgent. "I know you don't want to see me, but Mubai isn't picking up my calls. He doesn't want to see me. Can you let me see him?" When Yuan's voice became even colder. "Yimubai is a person, not an object. I have no right to decide. Besides, he's not at home." Lin Danny's voice became weaker. "Can we meet then? I'm at the cafe outside your apartment." When Yuan was silent. After a long time, she finally said, "Lin Danny, why must you do this?" In the end, she still went out. Because it was late at night, she put on a shawl and informed the aunt. She walked out of the neighborhood, pushed open the door of the cafe, and quickly found Lin Danny. Lin Danny sat there, her face haggard, completely different from her previous youthful appearance. When Yuan sat in front of her, she looked up, and her eyes were lifeless, just like the Wen Yuan from many years ago. "What would you like to drink?" Lin Danny raised her hand, revealing a red scar on her wrist. It was left behind when she cut her wrist last time. However, the wound on her hand had healed, but the wound on her heart had not. When Yuan looked at her quietly. After a while, he said in a low voice, "Give me a glass of water. I don't drink coffee." Lin Danny stared into her eyes and asked very slowly, "Is it because you want to get pregnant?" When Yuan, are you trying to use the child to tie him down? When Yuan really thought that Lin Danny was crazy. She held back her temper and said calmly, "Actually, there are some things you can ask him. If he doesn't want to tell you, it means that he doesn't want to be with you forever, or he feels pressured." "We almost had sex." Lin Danny suddenly said, "I know it's because he's married. Otherwise, he wouldn't have endured it." When Yuan also thought that she would suddenly bring this up. He shook his head and smiled. "What are you laughing at?" Lin Danny's voice became harsh. "You can't deny that he used to be with me. He only married you for Yi Xiangnan." At this time, the waiter served up plain water. When Yuan took a sip and then looked up. "If a man loves you, he won't let you suffer. Even if he wants a child, he will only choose a test tube." Lin Danny was furious. "That's because you've been pretending to be pitiful. What about you? Did you kill yourself in exchange for him?" When Yuan looked into Lin Danny's eyes. "Do you think pretending to be pitiful will work on you, Mubai? Lin Danny, you have such a good background. Don't lower yourself for a man." Chapter 3784. She doesn't love him. When Yuan's voice was faint. "You have money, looks, and you don't lack anything. Since you haven't done anything with him yet, you should let go of yourself completely. Otherwise, it will be too late when you regret it." Lin Danny was stunned. She felt that when Yuan was talking about her. After a long time, she murmured, "You don't love him anymore. Do you regret it?" When Yuan didn't say anything. She didn't admit or deny it. She just slowly drank the water in the cup. In the end, she said softly, "All passionate feelings, if they don't get a response, aren't even worth this cup of water. Lin Danny, I didn't want to see you because I was afraid that you would steal him away, but don't do anything stupid. It's not worth it. She had been very stupid before. She had once stood in the cold wind in the mountains of Yunnan for 2 days just to find that person. She was pregnant and went through despair. She waited for him in despair, but he came back. Whether he remembered it or not, he hated her. In his heart, she was a scheming woman. When Yuan felt that there was really no need to pour her heart out to a man without any self-esteem. It would be easier to live a more independent life. After she said that, she stood up and walked towards the door. Then, she saw Yi Mubai standing by the door. His gaze fell on her face. His gaze was deep and profound. At that moment, there were only a few words in Yi Mubai's mind. She didn't love him. She didn't feel anything. She regretted it. That was what she wanted to express to Lin Danny. Yi Mubai stared at Wen Yuan with an unfriendly gaze. However, Wen Yuan was very gentle. "You're back. Do you want to talk to her again?" He was still staring at her, and there was a hint of mockery in his voice. "Wen Yuan, when did you become so generous?" "I don't know either." She was still gentle as she looked up. "I'll go back first." "There's no need." He reached out and grabbed her hand, holding her hand as they walked outside. "Let's go back together." She was still talking. "Lin Danny, shut up." He suddenly scolded her angrily. Then he stopped in his tracks. He held her waist with one hand and pressed the back of her head with the other, kissing her lips fiercely. Wen Yuan was stunned. She never thought that he would kiss her here, and in front of Lin Danny. She did not want him to do this, as though he was just using her. She reached out and hammered his shoulders, her voice breaking, "Let go of me," but all the sounds were swallowed by him, and he held her tightly, not allowing her to struggle at all. Wen Yuan bit his lips, not knowing what to do. His technique was indeed brilliant, and he knew her body's weakness very well. Soon, her body softened under his attack. After the kiss, she looked up at him and said with a hint of anger, "Yi Mubai, what are you doing?" He stared at her face, which had become fresh because of the kiss, and couldn't help reaching out to touch her red lips. "Wen Yuan, you are my wife." She sneered and said in a mocking tone, "You've probably forgotten that you're a married man when you're flirting with others." As she said that, she pushed him away. "This is very boring, Yi Mubai." She paused for a moment. "I'm not the Wen Yuan from before. I won't get excited just because of a kiss or a few nice words from you. If you want this kind of feeling, you can find someone else." As she said that, she turned around and left. He stood behind her and said softly, "Wen Yuan, I know." She didn't turn around and just stopped in her tracks. He said in a distant voice behind her, "You don't love me anymore." Wen Yuan lowered his eyes and grunted vaguely before he left. Yi Mubai was stunned for a moment, and his heart ached slightly. He wanted to follow her, but Lin Danny walked over and hugged him from behind. "Mubai, I've been looking for you for a long time." He pushed her away almost immediately and pressed his hands on her shoulders. "Lin Danny, let's be clear. You saw that I have a wife." She anxiously tried to find a different attitude on his face, but his heart was as calm as still water. The love he used to have for her was completely gone. She suddenly stopped and said softly, "I heard Lin Shui say that you're looking at other women through me. I didn't believe it before, but now I believe it. That person isn't Wen Yuan, but someone else, isn't it?" Yi Mubai didn't deny it. Lin Danny laughed until tears rolled down her cheeks. She said softly, "I thought that other than Wen Yuan, I had no other opponents. So I'm just a substitute." She raised her head and said, "That Wen Yuan is worse off than me." She's right. She gave up her marriage, and it's too late for her to regret it. I'm still a little better than her. Yi Mubai, it turns out that Wen Yuan is the most pitiful woman. End of this chapter. Chapter 3785. She doesn't love him. Yimubai's expression didn't look too good. He ignored Lin Danny and walked out. At this moment, he didn't hate Lin Danny, but all the things he used to like her had disappeared. In his heart, he vaguely started to know that the hatred he used to have for Wen Yuan, the desperate nights, and all the unpleasant things he said to her weren't that simple. In that hatred, was there really not a bit of love mixed in? Those blurry memories were all emotions that he was unwilling to admit. Yimubai stood at the elevator and smoked. He didn't go back to the apartment immediately, but thought about it seriously. After thinking about it for a long time, he had a rough idea of what he was thinking. It seemed ridiculous for a man to only understand love and care after a few years. However, this time, he didn't reject it. He thought that his love for Wen Yuan wasn't love after a long time, nor was it love at first sight. He couldn't tell when it started. When he figured it out, the man's mood was different when he went home. He knocked on the door. Actually, he had the key, but he knocked on the door on purpose to let Wen Yuan open the door for him. He returned home half an hour later. It was almost 9 o'clock. The auntie had already left, so Wen Yuan could only open the door for him. When Wen Yuan opened the door, she lowered her head, but he still saw the redness in her eyes. Yimubai stood at the door and said softly, "Did you cry?" Wen Yuan shook her head. No. He still looked at her. After a long time, he took a step forward and held her chin. Wen Yuan was shocked. She looked a bit panicked and instinctively took a step back. He didn't let her leave. He reached out to hold her waist and pulled her forward. She immediately fell into his arms, looking a bit embarrassed. She rested her face on his shoulder. He wouldn't let her get up, but she didn't dare to make a sound. She also didn't dare to struggle too hard for fear of waking Xiangnan. Yimubai hugged her with one hand and gently stroked her back with the other. It was as if he was trying to soothe her. His voice carried a touch of gentleness that belonged to the night. It was very, very soft. "Aren't you going to ask me why I came back so late?" She lay on his shoulder and did not make a sound. His hand tightened around her waist and he said with dissatisfaction, "Wen Yuan. What do you want me to say? Or do you want me to ask you if you and Lin Danny are together again?" She deliberately said it in an unpleasant way, "Yimubai, I don't want to get involved in your affairs with her." "Because you don't love me anymore, do you?" He actually slapped her butt. "Wen Yuan, is it like this? You don't care who I'm with or even if I go to bed with her. You just need to lie down and bear with the disgust when we need to make love, right?" Wen Yuan bit his lip and said after a long time, "I didn't say that." "But you did," he said, with emphasis and resentment. She was forced to lie on his shoulder for a while. "Yimubai, what else do you want from me? I've done everything that needs to be done. This is all we can do." He stiffened at her words. After a long time, he pressed her shoulder. "Wen Yuan, time can dilute everything." She didn't understand what he meant, but he had already carried her into the bedroom. After that, she had to endure the wildest waves of Yimubai. He had never been like this before. When she was pressed against the door, her body floated up and down, but her mind was exceptionally clear. Why did he suddenly do this? Actually, he didn't need to please her like this. Moreover, the doctor had said that it would be easier to get pregnant if he did it 3 days after her period. She just ended it, and it would affect her pregnancy. Wen Yuan wanted to refuse, but he didn't let her go. He pestered her and forced her to do it, several times. When it was over, Wen Yuan lay on his side. He was wearing a new set of pajamas, and he slept neatly under the warm quilt. In the bathroom, Yimubai was taking a shower. She thought that he used to go to his bedroom to take a shower. Why didn't he go back today? She really wanted to sleep, but it had become her habit to wait for him to leave. With him here, she couldn't sleep. End of this chapter. Chapter 3786. After waiting for a long time, he finally came back from the shower. It could have been a minute, or it could have been 10 minutes. Seeing that she was still awake, Yimubai wiped the water off his hair and sat on the edge of the bed. He reached out and held her hand. His voice sounded a little low because he had just done it. "Do you still want it, huh?" When Yuan bit her lip and looked up at him. Then, he grabbed her waist and carried her over. It was easy for him to carry her, and she fell into his arms with a gasp. When Yuan was afraid of falling, so she instinctively wrapped her arms around his neck. His body was a little cold, but after a while, it became extremely hot. She couldn't help but shrink her fingers back because it was very hot. "Hold me," he whispered with some command. "When Yuan, can we talk now?" She looked down. "I'm a little tired." Lin Danny. He didn't intend to let her go. His voice was hoarse. "It's already in the past." She looked up at him and stared straight into his eyes. After a long time, she said, "I understand." He furrowed his brows and expressed his dissatisfaction with her indifference. However, Yimubai was a rather cold person to begin with, especially towards Wen Yuan. He really couldn't say anything particularly sensational at the moment. So, he just looked at her. He didn't say a word. She was the same. To her, these promises came too late. During their marriage, everything that should and shouldn't have happened had happened. Lin Danny had already committed suicide, so it could be imagined how far their relationship had gone. If a man hadn't doted on a woman and hadn't promised her anything, she wouldn't be stupid enough to commit suicide for him, especially a woman like Lin Danny who was well off. When Yuan only felt that it was a little ironic. It was too late. Just when her heart had turned cold. Yimubai looked at her indifferent face. He had originally been very passionate, but at that moment, it was all gone. It seemed that there wasn't much he wanted to say. "Let's go to sleep," he said hoarsely. Then, he naturally wanted to turn on the lights and sleep. When Yuan grabbed his hand and said anxiously, "Don't you want to go back to your bedroom?" He paused. The lights were still on, and he stared at her beautiful face, her beautiful collarbone, and the hickeys he had left on it. After a long time, he finally said, "Let's sleep together in the future." When Yuan's face was pale. "Why? We are husband and wife, isn't it normal for us to sleep together?" He said it matter-of-factly, not intending to explain to her. She had no interest in telling him about their emotional journey, and he didn't want to tell her either. So be it. He wanted to live with her now anyway. After saying that, he lay down with her in his arms. When Yuan lay down, but she was still in a daze. She was placed in his arms and smelled his scent. It was familiar yet strange. She had done it with him many times, but it was extremely rare for them to sleep together until dawn like this, so she kept her eyes open and kept looking at the dark night. Her eyes were black and white, and he could see them as soon as he lowered his head. Yimubai didn't pay much attention to her and closed his eyes. About half an hour later, he opened his eyes and saw that her eyes were still open. He was a little angry. "When Yuan, if you don't sleep, I'll pull you up and do it a few more times." She immediately closed her eyes. This book came from Chapter 3787. She doesn't love him. He didn't know whether he should comfort her or get angry. She didn't want to do it with him. Of course, he didn't really want to do it with her. It wasn't that he couldn't, but they had to have a child this month. Later on, they didn't sleep well that night, especially when Yuan tossed and turned in his arms. As long as he loosened up a little, she would turn her back to him and sleep on her own. The next second, he would pull her back again. Just like that, they didn't sleep well for the whole night. Early the next morning, when Xiangnan was about to get up, they were both exhausted. Moreover, the auntie wasn't coming anymore. When Yuan lifted the quilt and wanted to get up, Yimubai covered her with the quilt and said, "I'll go." When Yuan wanted to say something, but he pressed her neck and looked at her slightly bruised eyes. "Sleep for a while more." His voice was irresistible. When Yuan had no choice but to close her eyes again, Yimubai looked at her. Actually, if they were a normal couple, he should have given her a good morning kiss, but he looked at her face and didn't kiss her. Last night, he lost control of his emotions and disappeared after they did it a few times. He became the calm Yimubai again. However, such a calm couple was indeed lacking something in their marriage. It was only later that Yimubai realized that he wanted her to love him like before. He looked at her for a while and got up to leave. When he walked to Xiangnan's bedroom, the little guy had already sat up and covered his face with the quilt. Only his eyes were exposed, and he looked very cute. Yimubai's heart softened. He went over and kissed his son. "Get up." He wanted to help Xiangnan get dressed. Xiangnan's little face was red. He reached out and hugged him. "Daddy, I want to go to the bathroom." Yimubai was stunned for a moment, and then he laughed. "You want to pee?" Xiangnan's little face was red, and he didn't say a word. Yimubai carried him to the bathroom, put him on the toilet, and waited patiently by the side. Xiangnan was a little embarrassed. "Dad, you can wait for me outside." Yimubai left, but he still wrapped him in a small blanket for fear that he would catch a cold. Xiangnan's constitution was different from ordinary people. He couldn't catch a cold or a fever. Otherwise, it would be troublesome and not good for his illness. As a father, he didn't mind the stench and just waited at the side. In the end, he even helped his son wipe his butt. Actually, he wasn't a father who doted on his children, but at this moment, he just wanted to spoil his son. Xiangnan was carried by him to get dressed. She hugged his neck and suddenly asked, "Dad, are you living with Mom?" Yimubai was a bit surprised by his son's question. His hand paused for a moment, then he continued to help his son put on his clothes. At the same time, he asked casually, "What's wrong?" Xiangnan whispered, "Because everyone else's parents sleep together." Yimubai's hand paused again, then he smiled and said, "I thought you didn't understand these things." As he said that, he patted his butt. "You're so mischievous." Xiangnan probably felt that an adult doted on him, so he continued to ask boldly, "Then why are Dad and Mom sleeping together again?" Yimubai seemed to be thinking for a while, then he smiled and said, "Maybe, they need to get used to it slowly." Xiangnan made an "oh" sound. Later, he helped Xiangnan get dressed, and Xiangnan kissed him. "I'm going to brush my teeth." Yimubai looked at the little boy running away and smiled faintly. He thought to himself, how good it would be if Xiangnan didn't get sick. Updated tomorrow at noon. Updated tomorrow. End of this chapter. Chapter 3788. He looked at her quietly. He was going to make breakfast directly, but for some reason, he went back to Wen Yuan's bedroom. When he wanted to change his clothes, he remembered that he didn't live here, and there were no clothes for him. However, he saw that Wen Yuan wasn't asleep, so he sat on the bed and thought for a while before whispering, "Just now, Xiangnan asked me if we slept together." Wen Yuan was lying down, and her face was rosier than a few days ago. When he said that, she asked, "How did you answer?" Yimubai looked at her face buried in the quilt, and his heart softened. He reached out and gently stroked her face, a little absent-minded. After a while, he smiled. "I said that we need time, and we will always sleep together in the future." When Yuan thought that this was what he really wanted to say to her, she didn't feel anything and just closed her eyes gently. What time is the private flight in the afternoon? They had to go back to B City, stay for 2 days, and then go to the United States. Everything was ready. The only surprise was that before going to the United States, Yimubai's mental journey seemed to have changed. She didn't know why he was like this. If he wanted a docile wife, she would play it well. As for the other things, she couldn't give them, and she didn't want to give them. She didn't want to think about what he was thinking. There was nothing wrong with being an ordinary husband and wife. In a way, she had left the running of their marriage entirely to him, and he wanted it to be what he wanted it to be. After she finished asking, Yimubai's eyes fell on his wife's face. They were both adults, and it wasn't hard to guess what Wen Yuan was thinking. Of course, he could see it. But between husband and wife, between a man and a woman, these things were meaningless if they were exposed. Yimubai smiled and said in a slightly hoarse voice, "At 2 in the afternoon, you sleep for a while, and then we have to leave after eating something." Wen Yuan closed her eyes again and nodded. At this time, she was really a little sleepy, and she was a little relaxed. She fell asleep, and her face subconsciously rubbed against the pillow. A few strands of hair brushed against her white face. Yimubai looked at her and couldn't help but reach out and gently stroke her face, brushing away the hair. Wen Yuan hadn't fallen asleep yet. His face felt itchy, so he buried it into the pillow again. He looked at her for a long time, smiled, got up, and walked back to his bedroom. He changed into a black sweater and trousers. When he walked out, Xiangnan had also washed up and was sitting upright on a chair in the dining room, waiting for food. That little look was very cute. It was somewhat similar to Wen Yuan. Yimubai patted his little head and went to the kitchen to make breakfast. He had been living abroad for a long time and always ate Western food, but Xiangnan's stomach wasn't very good, so he still prepared Chinese breakfast. It was ready in half an hour and served to the dining table. Xiangnan drank the fragrant pumpkin porridge, his little head buried. Then, he raised his head. "Daddy, are we going to be city in the afternoon?" Yimubai nodded and reached out to rub his son's hair. "Yes, and in a few days, he will go to America." Xiangnan's little face was a little confused. Yimubai looked at his son. "Xiangnan, are you afraid?" The little boy shook his head. "No." Then, he lowered his head and continued to eat the pumpkin porridge. "With Daddy here, Xiangnan is not afraid." Yimubai's heart instantly warmed up, warm and soft. He thought that his decision was not wrong. Wen Yuan might not be the most important woman in his life, but Yi Xiangnan's position was irreplaceable. Chapter 3789. Later, he woke Wen Yuan up. Wen Yuan ate some food and started to take out their luggage. There weren't many, only 2 boxes, because Yimubai didn't allow them to take more. He said that they could buy a lot of things in America and that they would come back to stay here. Would they come back? Wen Yuan didn't know. When he left, he took the suitcases downstairs and put them into the trunk one by one. Later, he went upstairs to pick her and Xiangnan up. Because the downstairs was surrounded by reporters, they didn't know who had leaked the news. The reporters surrounded them and took pictures. Yimubai wore sunglasses the whole time, carrying Xiangnan in one hand and Wen Yuan in the other. Although the reporters were taking pictures, they didn't dare to get too close, nor did they dare to put the camera in front of him. Yimubai let them take pictures, pressing down on Xiangnan's face to prevent them from taking pictures. When Yuan lowered his head, Yimubai put the child in the car. Just as when Yuan was about to get in, Yimubai suddenly pulled her back. Her face was exposed to the camera, and he kissed her on the forehead. The cameras lit up. Their faces were clearly photographed. Also, this was a kind of announcement. When Yuan sat in the car, her mind was in a mess. After Yimubai drove past the reporters, he glanced at Wen Yuan in the rearview mirror and asked mildly, "What's wrong?" Her face was a little red and hot. She shook her head. Nothing, she still covered her face with her hand. Yimubai smiled faintly and didn't say anything. He continued to drive. At 2:00 in the afternoon, they flew to B City. Around 5 or 6 o'clock, they arrived at the place where he lived. It was a luxurious house in a famous area for the rich. Yimubai stopped the car and opened the back seat. When Yuan said softly, "Xiangnan is asleep." His gaze fell on Xiangnan's little face, then moved to Wen Yuan's face. He paused for a few seconds before saying mildly, "I'll carry him up. You just hold the bag. I'll go get the luggage later." When Yuan made an "oh" sound and did not fight with him for it. She wasn't a woman who did rough work. She lived a very delicate life. Although her husband didn't like her very much, she wouldn't belittle herself to think that she needed to take care of these things. She held on to the car door for him to carry Xiangnan and follow him in. There were 2 or 3 servants in the villa, who usually took care of the villa when he was not around. Moreover, they were not familiar with Yimubai and Wen Yuan's past, so when they entered, the servants all called them Mr. and Madam without any awkwardness on their faces. Yimubai carried Xiangnan upstairs to the master bedroom and carefully placed him under the quilt. Then he looked at Wen Yuan and said, "Sleep with him for a while. Dinner will be ready in 2 hours." Wen Yuan looked at him. He paused for a moment. "I have something to do outside. I'll have dinner with my family tomorrow. After resting for a day, I'll go to America." Wen Yuan listened quietly and didn't say anything. He looked at her and said hoarsely, "I know you don't want to, but Wen Yuan, we need to go abroad for a few years. When we come back, everything will be different." She didn't say anything. But he knew in his heart that she didn't want to go abroad. She didn't even want to live with him. However, he had already decided to live with her. He went out. When he came back, it was already night. When Yuan and Xiangnan had already come downstairs. They were lying in front of the window and looking outside. It was because it was snowing lightly outside. Yimubai walked towards them and got out of the car. Chapter 3790. Let's talk quietly. He went over and picked up Xiangnan from behind. He put him on his lap and sat with Wen Yuan, looking outside. "It's just a little snow. It can't be piled up." Xiangnan turned his head, his eyes sparkling. "Dad, what if the snow piled up? Does that mean we don't have to go to America?" Yimubai smiled and rested his chin on Xiangnan's head. He looked at Wen Yuan. "You don't want to go to America?" Xiangnan's voice was soft. "I don't know anyone in America, and I don't have Baianin." "You like Ainin?" Yimubai's voice became gentler and gentler, just like the fine snow outside. Yi Xiangnan nodded vigorously. "Yes, I like her very much." Yimubai smiled. "She's my sister." Xiangnan turned his head and looked at him strangely. "I know. Dad, are you thinking too much?" Yimubai, then he looked at Wen Yuan. Wen Yuan didn't say anything. He looked outside and then the corners of his mouth curled up slightly. So Yi Mubai moved closer to her and said in a hoarse voice, "Are you laughing at me?" "Nope." Wen Yuan pulled the shawl on his body and said in all seriousness. Yi Mubai sat side by side with their son on the back. It was really inconvenient to talk, not to mention that Yi Xiangnan was looking at them with his big eyes. He sighed to himself. Kids at this age. Of course, it was inconvenient to say some things, so he just smiled faintly. He doesn't look like you. Then who? Wen Yuan didn't think he looked like Yi Mubai either. Yi Mubai thought for a while and then frowned. Why do I feel like he looks like Bai Shuoli? What the hell? Wen Yuan didn't say anything. Motherfucker. They sat together and enjoyed the snow. 10 minutes later, Yi Mubai got up first. Okay, let's eat. We'll see later. In fact, it wasn't rare for it to snow in B City, but for children, every time it snowed, it was a magical experience. Xiangnan was still reluctant to let go, and from time to time, he would let out sounds of oh 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 oh. Yi Mubai looked at Wen Yuan. Wen Yuan didn't say anything. He smiled and picked up Xiangnan with one arm. Xiangnan was a little strange and was extremely happy. It was like a little mouse in his arms, squeaking. Wen Yuan looked at her and sighed. She looked a little like Shueli. The whole family ate together. The next day, they gathered for a meal in the main residence of the Yi family. Su Fu also went. Hao Yun was considerate of his wife, so he didn't go himself. Although he was worried about Yi Xinggang, he believed that he wouldn't do anything out of line with so many children around. Yi Mubai drove into the old residence of the Yi family with Xiangnan and Wen Yuan. Yi Mulan's car arrived at the same time. Bai Shuoli and Bai Anan were in the car. Bai Shuoli sat in the car, her eyes a little blurred. Yi Mulan stopped the car and rubbed his chin with his slender fingers. Coming here again, do you feel like you have me again? Bai Shuoli glanced at him and snorted. Stop it, you old bacon. He smiled. Old bacon made you cry last night, didn't he? Yi Mulan. Bai Shuoli was furious. Bai Anan is still in the car. Yi Mulan nodded and opened the door of the back seat. Anan, Xiangnan is here. Get out of the car and look for him. Bai Anan ran out of the car. Yi Mulan immediately closed the door and said to his wife, Okay, Anan is not in the car. End of this chapter. Chapter 3791. Bai Shuoli was speechless. Yi Mulan, you're shameless. Actually, he had been suppressing his anger for a long time. Last night, she had twisted her arms and legs for some reason. In the end, he could not bear to be rough with her and let her go. This morning, when she woke up and saw him in such a sorry state, she had laughed for a long time. Yi Mulan reached out and dragged her from the back seat, placing her on his lap. He was driving a limousine, and there was enough space for her to sit in. Bai Shuoli was very uneasy. She sat on his lap and reached out to hit his shoulder. You're crazy. Someone will see us. Not to mention that Yi Mubai's car was parked there, Wen Yuan might come over. Actually, she was thinking too much. Wen Yuan wanted to come over, but Yi Mubai knew his brother's urine very well. It must be bad taste to chase Bai Anan out of the car. At his age, only Bai Shuoli would be controlled by him. As expected, Yi Mubai dragged Wen Yuan and the two kids away, fearing that they would see something unsuitable for children. Bai Shuoli watched them leave. She stared at Yi Mulan. Get out of the car. Isn't it weird for us to be in the car? Yi Mulan leaned back, his voice a little lazy. Will you still be angry in the future? He pinched her cheeks. But I will, his handsome face blushed. It was just a change of position, and you made such a fuss. When he said that, Baishuali immediately leaned into his arms and said softly, "That's because you were too much. How can you be like that?" She wrinkled her nose and half lied. "It hurts." As she said that, she became a little embarrassed. Her slender arms wrapped around his neck and she buried her face in his chest. The person who had been afraid of being seen hugged her and refused to let go. She was a little shy and also a little dependent on him. After they got back together, they had a great relationship. Even Bai Anan was not as angry and clingy as she was. Yi Mulin often felt that she was his daughter and that she had picked up Bai Anan. He lowered his head and looked at his little wife in his arms. She was a few years younger than him and was innocent, so he usually gave in to her, except when it came to sex. Seeing her like this, his heart softened. "I'll be gentler next time, okay?" Biting her lip, she rested her face on his shoulder and bit him lightly. "Since when were you gentle?" Yi Mulin laughed and pinched her cheeks. "Who was the one who said that I would pay 10 million just for sleeping with you?" "Baishuali, is it that easy to earn my money?" She was speechless. She said that to reduce the number of times he had sex. It was too exaggerated for a man who was almost 40 years old to have sex 5 or 6 times a week. However, after she said that, he became more ferocious than before. He felt that he spent more money and was even more unscrupulous. Baishuali regretted it. She hugged him with her little arms and said pitifully, "Then I don't want the money, okay? You don't need money." He raised his eyebrows. "Then I'll come every night. It's free anyway." Baishuali he teased his little wife for a while. In fact, he did not really want to do anything. It was just that Mubai was tactful. There were still many servants in the old house, and they would see it eventually. He did not want to be watched by others. He kissed her cheek and stroked her little head. "All right, let's get out of the car. If we continue to stay here, people will think that we did it in the car." She glared at him. There were still 2 updates left. It would probably be updated brutally around the Lunar New Year. Chapter 3792. Yi Mulin kissed her again. "We'll talk about it tonight." Baishuali stayed there for a long time before she said, "Actually, what you mean is, let's do it tonight." Yi Mulin turned around and looked at her with a strange gaze. After a while, he smiled and said, "Oh, Baishuali, so you're looking forward to doing it with me, huh?" As he spoke, his fingers skimmed over her face, and finally pressed against her lips. There was a hint of meaning, and his gaze was really clear. Baishuali opened her mouth and bit his finger, then took it away and snorted, "It's sunny so early in the morning." Her eyes were also wide open, disapproving, but her cheeks were flushed, still bashful. Yi Mulin wasn't in a hurry to leave. With one hand on the car door, he admired his little wife's bashful expression. He thought to himself that she had done it with him countless times, but whenever he showed the slightest hint of wanting to do it with her, she would be especially embarrassed. He smiled, but his voice was hoarse. "You still know that I'm in the mood." She glared at him. Shameless. Yi Mulin leaned forward and nibbled on her cheek. "I don't need to use my face when it comes to you." Baishuali held on to his shoulder. She was a little embarrassed from being kissed by him, so she simply hugged him and buried her face in his shoulder. He looked around and saw that many servants were looking in their direction. He smiled and said, "Surely, there will really be people looking here." She leaned on his shoulder and refused to get up. His heart was indescribably soft. "You will be laughed at if you do this." You're already so big, and you're still lying. By surely, you're already in your early 30s. His voice was deep and husky. He despised her age but couldn't help but kiss her. He really felt that she was very cute. Bai Shuali wrapped her arms around his neck. I'm not over 30. He looked at her and smiled. Then tell me, how old are you? Bai Shuali hugged him and looked up at him. She actually knew what he liked, so she said softly, because I was 26 when I married you, and we were separated for 5 years, I should be 21 now. She hugged his neck and gently plucked a strand of white hair from his head and placed it in front of him. Uncle Yi, you're old. Her tone was especially sorrowful. She was so soft like a little fairy. How could he stand it? He pinched her chin with one hand and said, Uncle Yi will make you kneel and beg for mercy tonight. Suddenly, a certain image appeared in her mind. She blushed and bit her lip. Yi Mulin, you're too shameless. He chuckled, can't you change your words, Mrs. Yi? You're just cursing me. But I remember, you're only 21 years old, very young. When he said the last 2 words, he grinded his teeth and smiled meaningfully. Was he impatient to press her down and do it for her? Bai Shuali's face turned even redder. She scolded him, pushed him away, and ran away. He was too shameless. Yi Mulin slowly closed the car door, smiled, and chased after her. When he walked in, he saw his little wife sitting together with Wen Yuan. Her face was still a little red, and it was very human. Chapter 3793. As he spoke, he would occasionally look at his wife, his gaze gentle and lingering. This was the most beautiful image of them and their marriage. Although Bai Shuali was a little embarrassed, she couldn't bear to look away. She felt that he kept looking at her, and if she didn't, it would be a loss. Beside her, Wen Yuan almost couldn't stand her gaze anymore. He coughed lightly. You and Big Brother are very kind. Bai Shuali was a little embarrassed. Then, she seemed to have thought of something. Oh, are you and Little Bai still working hard? This topic, Wen Yuan couldn't say anything and could only laugh it off. Bai Shuali waited for a long time but didn't get an answer. In the end, she felt a little embarrassed. Wen Yuan said mildly, we will have another child. They had to have another child, for Xiangnan. Bai Shuali's Mandarin wasn't very good. She didn't know how she managed to change the topic to such a serious one, but she didn't dare to speak anymore. Wen Yuan sensed her careful thoughts and stopped laughing. Mulin was right. Shuali, you're actually very good. Oh, he did say that. When Bai Shuali mentioned her husband, Ding Dang appeared in her eyes again. The only thing missing was a red heart. Wen Yuan held back his laughter. Yeah, he said that often. Bai Shuali blushed again. She bit her lip. He has good taste. Wen Yuan might have found her amusing, so he deliberately said slowly, he said that you have good taste, but his own taste isn't that great. Even with Bai Shuali's intelligence, she actually thought about it for a long time before she understood what Wen Yuan meant. She cried out, Wen Yuan, he really said that. Wen Yuan grunted in agreement. It was rare for him to be mischievous. You can ask him when you go back. Bai Shuali clenched her little fists and said word by word, I definitely will. Wen Yuan laughed. As he was laughing, he inadvertently saw Yi Mubai's gaze. Their eyes met. She wanted to look away, but his gaze was like magic that stuck to her. She could only look at him and keep looking at him. After a long time, Yi Mubai finally left first and continued to talk to Yi Mulin. They talked about how to treat Xiangnan after they went to America. Bai Ainin and Yi Xiangnan went to play in the greenhouse of the light room. The servants at home were watching, so the adults could talk about some things. Su Fu and Yi Xinggang were also there. Although they were shocked by the fact that Xiangnan was Mu Bai's son, he was still a descendant of the Yi family. Therefore, their feelings towards him did not change. Was he still a biological grandson? Su Fu and Yi Xinggang were alone together. Su Fu sighed softly. The children are all fine. I think Mu Bai is also a little interested in Wen Yuan. Yi Xinggang snorted. What do you think of Wen Yuan's treatment of him? Is it interesting? He didn't think so. They looked like they had the same dream. There was no kindness at all. They were like a pair of completely different children. Su Fu felt uncomfortable being rebuked like that. She said mildly, actually, it doesn't mean that kindness from the beginning will last forever. Yi Xinggang was the one who was hurt by her words. His gaze fell on her face and he did not speak for a long time. After a long time, he said, Su Fu, you are talking about us, right? Chapter 3794. As Yi Xinggang spoke, his mood was also very complicated. His gaze fell on the face of his former wife, and he couldn't bear to look away. He was old, and he became very nostalgic. His wife was still the same as before. He couldn't find her anymore, and he didn't want to find her. No one was as good as his Su Fu. Of course, now it was Hao Yun's Su Fu. Yi Xinggang's voice was hoarse. How does he treat you? Su Fu smiled faintly. Pretty good. Our life is very ordinary. We live in an apartment, and we don't have any servants at home. Yi Xinggang frowned. How can that be? Without servants, you do all the work at home. Your hands will be rough. He said hatefully, the Hao family doesn't lack money. How can they treat you so poorly? Su Fu smiled faintly, and his tone was particularly calm. Most of the family work is done by Hao Yun. Xinggang, he doesn't treat me poorly. He really treats me very well. Yi Xinggang didn't quite believe it. He always felt that Hao Yun was too stingy. When Su Fu followed him in the past, how extravagant was her life. He was just about to say something when he suddenly saw the jade bracelet on Su Fu's hand. Whether it was the color or the water level, it was the best choice. Yi Xinggang remembered that the Hao family's ancestor was a second-rank civil official in the Qing dynasty. Such a good thing didn't exist except in the past and present. He also knew that Su Fu's bracelet was an heirloom of the Hao family. Moreover, wearing hundreds of millions of yuan on her hand, she definitely wouldn't do any family work. He felt both comforted and a little upset. Su Fu was living a good life, but he always hoped that her life wasn't so good. That way, he would still have a chance. Yi Xinggang thought so. But Su Fu didn't need it. She was very good. In her twilight years, they could still sit together and chat occasionally because of the children, which was already very good. Yi Xinggang looked at the clouds in the sky and sighed. If I could hold it back at that time, how good would it be? He looked at her sideways. Su Fu, I regret and am sorry to hurt you. He was already so old, so he wasn't afraid that she would laugh at him if he spoke his mind. Sometimes, I think that I was possessed back then. At that time, I was young and ambitious. I thought that what a successful man had was status, money, a wife, children, and a mistress. He smiled bitterly. I had everything, but I lost you. Su Fu didn't say anything. She just looked at him. Su Fu, of course. Old friend. Yi Xinggang smiled bitterly. Su Fu smiled at him and said warmly, Xinggang, even without me, you still have Mu Bai and Mulin. Su 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 fu, su su chin. Su su fu, at su yi. Of tea at Su Fu grunted in acknowledgement and walked with him. After a while, Yi Zhengang couldn't help but say, "Aren't you wearing too little?" "No, the sweater inside is very thick. In winter, Hao Yun will buy thick cashmere for me to wear." She said it carelessly, but it was like she was showing off a lot of affection, making Yi Zhengang imagine the scene of love and affection between them. He felt extremely displeased, but there was nothing he could do, so he could only feel a little sour. In the hall of the main residence, two young couples were together, and the atmosphere was a little strange. Bai Shuali and Yi Mubai almost got married, and Wen Yuan and Yi Mulin had a fake marriage. Now, they had all changed back. After looking at each other for a while, Yi Mulin spoke first. "Are you ready?" Yi Mubai nodded. "Almost. We'll leave early the day after tomorrow." Chapter 3795. Yi Mulin chatted with him for a while and suddenly said to Wen Yuan, "Shueli and I will bring an N to visit Xiangnan when we're free. Call Shueli if you need anything." Wen Yuan knew that he was worried that Yi Mubai wouldn't treat her well. She was touched. After all, she and Yi Mulin had used each other back then, but he had been helping her in the end. Yi Mulin had a good grasp of life. The reason why he dared to get into this fake marriage was because he had Bai Shueli in his grasp. But Wen Yuan had messed up his life. She and Yi Mubai were completely different. They didn't have any feelings for each other, so they broke up easily. Until now, she vaguely felt that he wanted to live a good life with her, but she didn't feel much about it. When a woman's child is sick, when her husband has other women outside, and he betrays you, you will become indifferent to everything. Only a fool would care too much about someone. In her heart, she only hoped that Xiangnan would be happy. As she thought about it, she looked up and met Yi Mubai's gaze again. She was a little confused and didn't know what he wanted. She couldn't figure out what he wanted. Wen Yuan pursed her lips and pretended not to see his gaze. She didn't dare to look at his eyes all the time. Later, during dinner, Wen Yuan sat next to Yi Mubai. She felt a little uncomfortable. After all, she was the eldest daughter-in-law. Now that she was the second daughter-in-law, she felt a little uncomfortable. At this moment, Yi Zhengang said, "Mubai, there's something I want to talk to you and Wen Yuan about." Yi Mubai froze for a moment and then looked at his father. Yi Zhengang thought about it and said slowly, his gaze landing on his youngest son and Wen Yuan, "It doesn't matter to the people outside, but shouldn't you explain it to Wen Yuan's family? Don't make it so that Wen Yuan will have to explain himself when he returns to his parents' home." As he said that, Yi Mubai glanced at Wen Yuan. Wen Yuan looked down. Her situation in the Wen family was not good. When she divorced Yi Mulin, her parents almost broke up with her. Even when she left B City, they did not ask her to stay. To put it bluntly, she was driven out by Wen Yuan. The Wen family was ashamed of her because she was no longer Yi Mulin's wife. She was also burdened with so many unpleasant rumors. Wen Yuan lowered his eyes. After a long time, he finally said in a low voice, "Actually, there's not much of a need." With regards to this, Yi Zhengang was rather insistent. "Wen Yuan, you can cut ties with the Wen family for now. What about Xiangnan and your and Mubai's next child? Are you going to cut ties with them in the future?" His voice was powerful and resonant. "It might be a little awkward for now, but have you ever thought that perhaps Xiangnan also needs to find his bone marrow in the Wen family? His consideration could be considered to have done his part." Wen Yuan no longer had any reason to refuse. He softly agreed. When she said yes, her eyes were filled with tears. There was some grievance and some unknown fear. Under the table, a hand grabbed hers. She was startled for a moment, and then she met Yi Mu-bai's gaze. He smiled faintly. "I'll go with you tomorrow." Wen Yuan bit his lip and did not say anything. She wanted to pull her hand away, but he did not let her go. Instead, he held her hand tightly. Yi Mu-bai's gaze was a little profound. He held her hand with one hand, but the other hand on the table naturally picked up a piece of pork rib and gave it to her. He said briefly, "Eat, you're too thin." As a mother-in-law, Su Fu could not stand it anymore. "Mu-bai, you can't be like this. You have to be gentler to your wife." Chapter 3796. She is now Yi Mu-bai's wife. Wen Yuan ate quietly. His hand under the table was still holding her hand. Sometimes, Wen Yuan would look at him with a pleading look in his eyes, but Yi Mu-bai pretended not to see it. Sometimes, Wen Yuan would look at him with a pleading look in his eyes, but Yi Mu-bai pretended not to see it and pretended not to notice. Eventually, Wen Yuan stopped struggling and let Yi Mu-bai hold her hand. If she wanted to eat something, he would look at her eyes and give it to her. He took good care of her, as if they were an old couple. Even Yi Mu-bai and Bai Shuali would look at them frequently. Bai Shuali, in particular, felt that it was a little unbelievable. On the way back, she sat next to Yi Mulin. There were only the two of them in the car because An was taken back by Su Fu and Hao Yun. Bai Shuali turned her head and said in a daze, "Yi Mulin, did you notice that Mu-bai treats Wen Yuan differently?" Yi Mulin was wearing a set of black clothes. The coat he was wearing was black, but because the texture was good, he looked especially handsome. She admired her husband as she talked about business. Her heart was beating like a little rabbit, and her eyes were pink. When Yi Mulin turned his head, he accidentally saw the look in his wife's eyes. He was stunned for a moment before smiling and continuing to drive. He coughed lightly and said, "Tell me, what's different?" Bai Shuali's eyes turned pink again when her husband laughed at her. At that moment, Yi Mulin's voice came over faintly, "Shuali, it's hard for me to focus on driving when you keep looking at me like that, N." She was mesmerized and was stunned for a moment. After a while, she came back to her senses and bit her lips, blushing a little. "I'm not." "That's good. I thought you would be blushing when you look at me and want to tear off my clothes." He continued, "Shuali, you still have to be careful when you drive, N." Her face turned even redder. She leaned against the back of the seat and bit her fingers, not replying to him angrily. Although what he said was the truth, he couldn't say it out loud like that. Didn't she want face? She was angry and didn't speak for a long time. However, Yi Mulin would occasionally look at her while driving. She saw him and said angrily, "Didn't you say to be careful when you drive?" She was angry. Yi Mulin smiled silently. He stopped the car at the red light at the intersection ahead and bit her cheek. "I haven't finished what I wanted to say just now." Her mind was blank. There was only the warmth of his bite left in the world. Bai Shuali secretly blamed herself in her heart. Was she too unreserved? In the face of his beauty, she was too easily tempted. This wouldn't do. She had to change. So she turned her head and smiled. "You're the one who didn't answer." Yi Mulin touched his chin and suddenly smiled. They must have slept together. At that moment, the light turned green and Mulin continued to drive. Shuali, Yi Shuali's Yi. At that moment, the light turned green and Yi Mulin continued driving. She thought that she had the upper hand and he wouldn't mention this topic anymore. However, Yi Mulin said after a long time, they didn't have sex with the intention of getting pregnant. Bai Shuali burst into laughter. Then, she turned her head to look at her husband with a complicated look in her eyes. She squeezed out a smile. Yi Mulin's way of putting it is really unique. She really didn't want to talk to him. He used to be a lawyer and now he was a leader. His words were getting more and more shameless. He was doing it on purpose to make her blush. He knew that she would be embarrassed when he said it. She was obsessed with his body, just like a dog smelling the fragrance of meat. How could she sleep if she didn't eat meat that night? Damn old man, he always used this trick to seduce her, but she just didn't live up to his expectations. Then, she remembered that he had asked Anan to go back with Su Fu because of this. So, she stared at him with a strange and guarded expression. Yi Mulin chuckled as he drove. By Shuali, you have your period this Monday and Tuesday. I'm on a business trip on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Think about it, I haven't come properly this week. Yi Mulin, you're doing it on purpose. You're so bad. She took off her shoes and put her feet on the seat. She curled up and stared at him with tears in her eyes. She was afraid of such a situation. He was almost a man in his 40s. If he didn't do it for a few days, he would be like a ton of explosives. He wouldn't be able to sleep tonight. She didn't understand how he lived those years. How did he live before he was 32 years old? They were both virgins when they were together. End of chapter. Chapter 3797. She is now my wife. Yimubai 2 by Shualan bit her lip and thought to herself, how did he survive those 32 years? Could it be that she was his only choice? Thinking of this, her heart was filled with happiness. His request, which exceeded that of an ordinary man, also became less unbearable. Bai Shuali thought to herself. Actually, she didn't have any other man, but she thought that his behavior should be abnormal, right? As she thought about it, she bit her lip and stared at him thoughtfully. Yi Mulin drove and didn't say anything. He just glanced at her when he stopped the car. She was playing with her phone. The web page on her phone was opened, and a few big words were very eye-catching. How often was a man supposed to do it, and his little wife was watching with great interest. Yi Mulin laughed soundlessly and said calmly, "Let's get off." She glanced at him and carefully put her phone away, afraid that he would see it. Yi Mulin found it funny, but he didn't say anything. He unbuckled his seatbelt and pulled her out of the car. In the elevator, he kept looking at her. Bai Shuali felt a little guilty. "Why are you looking at me?" He smiled. "Nothing." He leaned against the wall of the elevator, his long arms and legs crossed, looking rather casual and seductive. He didn't seem to be in a hurry. He wasn't in a hurry, but Bai Shuali was. She had checked the information just now. For a man of his age, 2 times a week was enough. 3 times was a lot, but he was at least 5 days a week. If it was the number of times, she felt that it was too inhuman. Bai Shuali's eyes were filled with curiosity, and she kept looking at him. Yi Mulin smiled lazily. When the elevator arrived, he leaned over and pinched her cheek. "Don't think I'll let you go just because you pretend to be innocent." She howled and stared at him again. After a long while, she whispered, "You look like a beast." When the elevator arrived, it opened with a ding. He carried her home, and when he got home, he used the family rules on her. He pinched her cheeks and pulled her to the side, causing her to grimace in pain. She cried out in a muffled voice, "Yi Mulin, you're too perverted. Your behavior is just like an M." He let go of her face and laughed. "Bai Shuali, do you know what M is?" She bit her lip and snorted softly, using violence. "Wrong." He leaned close to her ear, and his thin lips gently burned her ear. "If you want to know, I can teach you." Baw, baw, baw. She glared at him, feeling that he was too shameless. Who wants to learn this? Yi Mulin smiled. I thought you had a strong thirst for knowledge. You didn't check how many times a man goes on the internet. What, you don't dare to know this? Bai Shuali's little face suddenly turned red, and her voice was also stuttering. After a long time, she burst out a sentence, how did you know? He squinted at her. Be more careful next time, and you won't be discovered. After that, he took off his coat and threw it on the sofa. He looked at her and asked, do you want to take a shower together? Is this an invitation? Actually, it was not a big deal for a couple to take a shower together, but Bai Shuali still felt a little embarrassed. It was really too much pressure. If he had any requests in the bathroom, she would be very uncomfortable. She was used to doing that kind of thing in bed, so she refused without thinking. Yi Mulin seemed to feel that it was a pity, but he just smiled and did not say anything. End of this chapter. Chapter 3798. She is now Yi Mubai's wife. Bai Shuali watched helplessly as her husband walked into the bathroom. Then, she quickly ran into the bedroom and threw herself onto the bed. She hugged the pillow and rolled around a few times. Finally, she pressed the pillow and fanned herself a few times. She imagined that she was abusing Yi Mulin. She felt very comfortable. S.U.M.U. At the door of the bathroom attached to the master bedroom, Yi Mulin was only wearing a pair of trousers and holding a towel in his hand. He leaned against the door and looked at her with interest. When he was almost done, he chuckled and said, Shuali, I didn't know you were so duplicitous. You want to know new knowledge so much. Bai Shuali was stunned. She was still sitting on the pillow, looking back at him like a pitiful little girl. Yi Mulin chuckled and stared at her. Yi Mulin. She sounded pitiful. You must have seen it wrong, so you forgot. Oh, I heard someone wanted to. Me. He walked to the changing room and chuckled. After I take a shower, Mrs. Yi, you can do as much as you want. She couldn't see him, but she heard him opening the wardrobe in the changing room to find clothes. She buried her face in the pillow and moaned. Others didn't know him, but she knew it very well. He did it on purpose. He had a bad sense of humor. It was like sharpening the knife in front of the pig for a long time before killing it. He just didn't want to give it a quick death. She punched the pillow and cursed him several times in her heart, but when he came out, she still looked like she was begging him to let go. Yi Mulin held the bathrobe in his hand and looked at her with a terrifying gaze. After a while, he walked into the bathroom again. Bai Shuali lay on her stomach again and drew circles on the pillow with her little hand. She was a little excited and a little scared. After a while, she turned off the lights, leaving only the bedside lamp on. She listened to the sound of water in the bathroom and waited for him. After waiting for a few minutes, she was about to fall asleep. Yi Mulin came back after the shower and saw his little bug squinting as if she was about to fall asleep. He was angry and amused at the same time. He patted her butt and said, You fell asleep so soon. She was woken up by his slap. She lied on her stomach and said, I'm so tired. Yi Mulin, can we do it tomorrow morning? If he woke up at 6 o'clock, he would have to get up at 7 o'clock. Even if he had an hour, he wouldn't be able to do it twice at most. This was Bai Shuali's experience after being tormented by him countless times. Yi Mulin glanced at her and chuckled. He sat down and turned on the lights, the kind that was as bright as snow. Bai Shuali bit her lip. Don't turn on the lights. But he still opened it. Not only did he open it, He even said in a low voice, "You want to slack off, huh?" I didn't. Her voice was coquettish, and then she put her arms around his neck and said, "Yimu, can you let me go? I'll do it with you tomorrow morning. It's been hard for me to translate and take care of an these days." He was amused and angry at the same time. Actually, she was afraid. He reached out and stroked her hair thoughtfully. "But surely, I miss you." As he said that, he leaned over and gently bit the tip of her nose, kissing and nibbling. This method was too intimate. She really couldn't stand him like this. She pursed her lips and said in a low voice, "Yi Mulin, if you want to do it, hurry up." He was clearly frying a small fish. Now that she was almost done, how could she not know? He was the worst. I'll update tomorrow. Try to update in the morning. End of this chapter. Chapter 3799. She is now Yi Mubai's wife. Seeing that she was almost done, he chuckled and kissed her deeply. He tormented her for half the night and only let her go at 2 in the morning. The main reason was that he had a meeting the next morning, so he had to restrain himself. When it was over, she wanted to sleep right away, but she couldn't bear to. When she was clean, she laid in his arms and said in a low voice, "Hubby, will Mubai and Wen Yuan do the same as us?" Yi Mulin smiled. She had asked this question. She had asked that question. He reached out and caressed her hair. Then, he asked, "I don't have a hobby of peeping. Do you want me to ask Mubai or you ask Wen Yuan?" She lost all interest when she heard that. She couldn't do such a private thing. She looked at him and yawned. "I'm going to sleep." Yi Mulin lay down and looked at her sideways. He couldn't help but smile. His little wife was in his arms and her legs were on him. She was very restless. "Hey, Shweli," his voice was very husky. "How can I sleep with you like this?" She was really sleepy. She buried her face in his neck. It was so warm and comfortable. After a long time, she murmured, "You didn't object to sleeping like this in the past. You were the one who said that I was as light as a kitten." Yi Mulin turned his body and looked at his little cutie. He said in a low voice, "You might not have understood what I meant." As he said that, he pulled her little hand over and let her experience it herself. She had her eyes closed, but she was so hot that she almost jumped up. She looked at him with her eyes wide open. "Yi Mulin, you are really a beast." He had been tormenting her for half the night. Wasn't it enough? She thought to herself. He was almost 40 years old. She was really tired. It wasn't that she didn't want to accompany him to make him happy. It was because his needs were too great. Sometimes, she thought that he was secretly taking pills. She often saw the news about some big boss taking pills, but Shuli was like a little worm cuddling up to him bravely. Her face was close to his, and her voice was also very low. "Mulin, did anyone give you any wine or special pills?" Yi Mulin was a little startled at first. It only took him 2 seconds to figure out her intentions. He reached out and patted her butt. "Someone even gave me a woman." She giggled foolishly for a moment, then quietly asked warmly, "Have you ever accepted one?" He rolled his eyes at her. "What do you think?" Baishuli smiled and said, "How would I know? This kind of thing happens very quickly. You just need to take off your pants. Why didn't you tell me about it?" His palm dangerously landed somewhere. "You're having fun. Say it again, huh?" How could she dare to say anything more? She cried out and buried her face in his chest, not daring to say anything more. If she continued, she would be beaten. She knew him the best. As he continued to beat her, he would probably bully her as he pleased. She acted coquettishly, begged for mercy, and praised him. She said whatever he wanted to hear now. Even someone as hard to please as Yi Mulin relaxed his brows and stopped making things difficult for her. Bai Shuali's voice continued to be soft. It hurts. I won't be coming tomorrow night. Then, she hugged his arm coquettishly and looked at him pitifully. Yi Mulin stared at her for a while. Then, he sat up and pressed her down. She was a little uneasy. End of the chapter. Chapter 3800. It really hurts. His voice was very gentle. Rice Worm, who had only felt a little pain, immediately became even more delicate. She nodded and said, "It really hurts." Then, she stretched out her slender arms and wrapped them around his neck, looking especially delicate. Yi Mulin sighed in his heart. How could he not know that she was putting on an act? She was clearly in a good state tonight. It was impossible to say how much pain she was in. A man who had been married for a long time would more or less understand. However, he still enjoyed it when she acted coquettishly. He reached out to hug and kiss her. "I'll go get the medicine for you." "Oh," she said, but still didn't let go of his neck. Yi Mulin smiled and lowered his head to kiss her. He kissed her intensely until her body went limp. In the end, she still felt a little embarrassed. She bit her lips and didn't come back to her senses for a long time. Seeing her absent-minded look, he almost couldn't bear it anymore. However, he couldn't touch her tonight. Yi Mulin exhaled with difficulty and got up to get the medicine to help her apply it. Bai Shuali had been obediently watching him with watery eyes. He looked at her as if he was looking at a spoiled child, doting on her. Bai Shuali's heart was suddenly filled with love for him. She asked him softly, "Yi Mulin, have you ever regretted it?" He continued to rub the ointment on her gently. It was very intimate. He could see that she was a little excited, but they both restrained themselves. He answered her, "You mean with you?" She grunted and buried her face in the snow-white pillow. She gently bit her clenched fist and said in a low voice, "I know you like being a lawyer, but now you'll probably have to serve the people until you're old." As he spoke, he giggled unkindly. "I can only retire at around 60 years old, and I can't go abroad at any time. For someone like you who likes to eat Western food, it seems pretty miserable." He reached out and pinched her cheek. "How dare you gloat over my misfortune, huh?" As he spoke, he placed his hands on both sides of her body and bent down to kiss her on the lips. His voice was hoarse as he said, "You're wrong. I like Chinese food now." As he said that, he kissed her in a particularly outrageous manner. Bai Shuali's mind was in a mess. "Eat Chinese food?" She turned her head and looked at her husband. "Yi Mulin, you've become greasy." He smiled, still hovering above her, and kissed her again. "Then, do you prefer the way I used to be, or do you prefer me to be more brutal in bed?" His family's rice worm bit his lip and refused to speak. "Okay, go to sleep." He rolled to the side and carefully held her in his arms, patting her gently as if he was coaxing a baby. She was really flattered. She leaned on his shoulder and asked rather pretentiously, "Yi Mulin, do you love me very much?" He opened one eye and looked at her. Then he smiled. "Oh, probably." She was a little dissatisfied and muttered in a low voice, "All right, let's sleep." Now, she did not feel as much love, so she turned her back to him. He was angry. Yi Mulin was amused and annoyed at the same time. He chased after her and gently nibbled her shoulder. His voice sounded low in the night. "Do you want to ask why I still treat you like a child?" She did not answer. He reached out and pulled her hair, saying slowly, because the first time I saw you, you were a high school girl, like a child. The sweetness between the two of them could not be stopped once it was written. Chapter 38:01. She is now Yimubai's wife. Bai Shuali bit her lower lip with her back to him. Yi Mulin smiled. Why? Are you shy? Of course not. Her voice carried a hint of fluttering, and then she turned over, hugging him tightly. Yi Mulin looked down at her and knew that she was shy. Actually, he couldn't say how many good points his little wife had. He only knew that when he saw her following behind Mubai, he felt a little unhappy in his heart. He always secretly thought, why doesn't she look at me? His looks are obviously not worse than Mubai's, and his homework is not just a little better than Mubai's. So he came to a conclusion, superficial. But now, he liked her superficiality and simplicity. She was just right. Asterisk on the other side of City B, Yimubai brought Wen Yuan and Xiangnan home. Xiangnan fell asleep, and Wen Yuan carried him the whole way and carefully covered him with a wool blanket. When they arrived at the villa, she wanted to get out of the car, but Yimubai stopped her. Don't move. As he spoke, he got out of the car first, then went to the back door to open it. He took Xiangnan from Wen Yuan's hands. Pull the blanket. Wen Yuan pulled it carefully, then got out of the car and escorted him to carry Xiangnan into the villa. She walked in front, opened the children's room, and let him carry Xiangnan in. The room was warm. Yimubai carefully put down Xiangnan, then gently took off the little guy's coat and put it under the quilt. He also asked someone to bring a hot water bag. He did all of this naturally and skillfully, as if he had been a father for a long time. Wen Yuan stood by the side. He did everything, and she felt a little unnecessary. Later, she simply said, I'll go back to the room first. Yimubai's gaze was still on Xiangnan's face. After a long time, he looked up and quietly looked at her face. You go to sleep first. Wen Yuan didn't say anything. She just went back to her room to take a shower. It was a little late, but she didn't plan to sleep first. She wanted to talk to him. She didn't know when he was going back to his room to sleep or if he didn't plan to sleep with her tonight. She would rather it was the latter, but she still waited for him for a long time. About an hour later, he returned to his room. When he saw Wen Yuan leaning against the headboard, he seemed a little surprised. As he took off his sweater, he asked, Why aren't you asleep yet? Wen Yuan looked at her quietly. Under the warm yellow light, his face was not as unapproachable as usual, so she easily said what she wanted to say. I'll go home tomorrow. Actually, you don't have to accompany me. Yimubai took off his sweater and threw it on the sofa. He was only wearing a pair of black trousers. He frowned and asked, Reason? After a pause, he added, Or are you waiting for Yi Mulin to go back with you? That's not possible. Wen Yuan couldn't take it anymore. That's not what I meant. I just don't have a good relationship with my family. You really don't have to accept this cold treatment for me. Their attitude won't be good. Really? He looked at her. You mean I don't have to go back in the future? After a pause, he said, Wen Yuan, the Wen family and the Yi family are connected by marriage. Since our affair has been exposed, we have to deal with it properly. You and Yi Mulin are husband and wife in name, aren't you? As he said this, he looked at her with a burning gaze. In fact, there was a trace of uncertainty. Wen Yuan lowered his head and didn't answer. End of this chapter. Chapter 38:02. Yimubai looked at her for a while and then said, "It's decided." Then he took a shower, put on a bathrobe, returned to the bedroom, pulled back the covers, and lay down beside her. As soon as he laid down, he felt that her body was extremely stiff. Thus, he lightly said, "Don't worry, I won't touch you tonight." As a result, her body became even stiffer. In the dark, Yimubai looked at her face. "Wen Yuan, what are you so nervous about?" Wen Yuan bit his lips and shifted his body backward. His voice was soft as he said, "You said you wouldn't touch me. If you continue to be so stiff, I promise I'll make you soft." He threatened before letting go of her and closing his eyes. "Wen Yuan, I don't have the energy to play games with you anymore. Sleep." Wen Yuan looked at her quietly for a while and then closed her eyes. But how could she sleep? Yimubai was right beside her. She also felt a little bitter. Many years ago, she had fallen madly in love with him. She had every single poster of him at home, and she had 10 thick volumes of newspaper clippings. Every single one of them was about him. She had secretly fallen in love with him like a loyal little fan. But now, he was sleeping beside her, but she was not in the mood. Even the title of Mrs. Yi couldn't comfort her. She didn't know when her love and affection for him disappeared. She knew what he wanted from her. She thought that this was probably how women gave up. She couldn't fall asleep, but she was afraid that she would disturb him, so she secretly turned her back to him. However, the moment she turned, he sat on her back and hugged her. Her back was tightly wrapped in his embrace, Yimubai. Her voice was very soft. "I just can't sleep. How about we sleep in separate rooms? Don't even think about it." His voice came from behind her in the darkness. His hot breath was on her neck, causing waves of arousal. Yimubai's voice became hoarse. "I thought your body didn't feel anything." "So it does." As he said that, he turned her over and pressed her down. He stared at her in the darkness with a gaze like that of a beast. Then, he buried his head. She knew that he wouldn't do it because he wanted to preserve his strength to make her pregnant, but she didn't expect that he would do that. He didn't seem like a man who liked to serve women like that, but he did it. Half an hour later, she fell asleep in his arms with tears in the corner of her eyes. Yimubai locked her face, and his gaze was probing, when Yuan sat on the bed alone and scratched his head. Suddenly, he felt that this marriage was not as difficult as he had imagined. She was a woman and always had physiological needs. A husband with good looks, physical strength, and skills was a good choice. Besides, Xiang Nan was also taken care of, so she really shouldn't be too demanding. She thought, "This is it, we can live together, as long as we don't act like idiots like we used to." She wouldn't get hurt if she didn't give her heart. She didn't stay in bed. She immediately got up to brush her teeth and wash her face. When she walked downstairs, Xiangnan and Yimubai were having breakfast. Seeing her come over, he reached out and pulled out the dining chair for her. "I'll go with you later. Xiangnan will stay at home." When Yuan looked outside, it seemed to have snowed, and there was a thin layer of snow outside. She was a little worried that she wouldn't be able to fly to America on time tomorrow. She wanted to chat with more like-minded people about new wife number 1, husband, addicted to pampering. Talking about life and looking for a confidant recommending the urban guru Shirshinshu. Chapter 3803. When Yuan didn't say anything else and ate his breakfast quietly, Xiangnan just watched them. He still didn't understand the world of adults. After breakfast, Yimubai made arrangements for Xiangnan before getting into the car with Wen Yuan. She thought that they would go straight to the Wen family, but he drove into a square instead. When they got out of the car, Wen Yuan was stunned. "What are we doing here?" Yimubai unbuckled his seatbelt and said faintly, "You can't be thinking that I'll go to your house empty-handed, right?" Wen Yuan finally understood what he wanted to say. But after thinking about it, he still got out of the car with him. They walked past the boutiques one after another, but he didn't enter any of them. Finally, they came to a very exquisite shop. He picked out a set of teacups and looked at it carefully for a while before asking the owner to wrap it up. The owner was a gentleman wearing sunglasses and smiled. "Sir, you have good taste. This set is the treasure of our shop and it's not cheap either. Many people like it but they don't have the fate to be with it." Hearing that, Wen Yuan looked at the price again and was stunned. It was actually 6 figures. Isn't it a little expensive for a set of teacups for 300,000? Even though Wen Yuan came from a good family, he wasn't from a business family after all. He was still reluctant to spend money like this, feeling that it wasn't worth it and that it was too high profile. Yimubai looked at her. "Is it expensive? Then what did Yi Mulin buy when he went to your house in the past?" He believed that he couldn't bring out cheap things. Wen Yuan looked at him and didn't know what to say. He was a little speechless. After a long time, she said in a low voice, "Can you stop talking about Mulin? You know that we were faking our marriage." Yimubai swiped his card and took the wrapped gift box. He looked at her again. "Your marriage certificate was fake too." Wen Yuan, he looked at her and walked to the counter opposite that specialized in jade. Wen Yuan had heard of this brand before. It was very expensive. She reached out to hold him. Shouldn't you give me a small gift on your first visit?" He looked at her quietly. "Or do you want your parents to think that you are much poorer than your previous wife?" Wen Yuan had nothing to say. He felt that Qin Haodong was a little weird today. However, since Qin Haodong liked to spend money, so be it. She didn't care anymore and followed behind him. When he looked at her, she casually pointed at the most expensive one. Anyway, her mother liked the expensive ones, and she liked the ones with very green emeralds. The price was also very good, and one of them was probably worth a few million. Yimubai looked at her and frowned. "Are you sure?" "I'll take this one. She'll like it." Wen Yuan pursed his lips and said indifferently. He bought it, but he wasn't in a hurry to pay the bill. Instead, he looked at it carefully for a while and finally picked out an ice-type floating sun-green bracelet with a thin ring mouth. "Take this one out and have a look." The manager smiled and squinted his eyes. "This is the treasure of our store. Sir, you really have a good eye. Look at this material. It's as delicate as your wife's skin. This kind of head is very good. It looks great on you." Yimubai took it, held Wen Yuan's arm, and casually put it on. Then, he agreed with the manager's words. It was really beautiful. Wen Yuan's arm was thin and white. With the ring, it looked especially classic and exquisite. He looked at it for a while and looked up at her. His voice was a little hoarse. "Don't take it off." Wen Yuan bit his lip. "I need to play the guqin sometimes, and it's not convenient to do housework. What if it breaks?" End of this chapter. Chapter 3804. She is now my wife, Yimubai 9. "Then I'll buy another one," he said without thinking. He always felt that it suited her. She didn't say anything else and watched him swipe the card. Her mother's was okay, it was more than 2 million, but hers was very, very expensive, it was more than 30 million. When Yuan suddenly felt that he had brought her to buy something, and her parents were just passing by. Later, he bought some small things for her relatives. Before this, Wen Yuan always felt that Yi Mubai was not a down-to-earth person, while Yi Mulin was more attentive. In fact, it turned out that they were brothers who were equally good at worldly affairs. She couldn't help but wonder if it was because of his attentiveness that Lin Danny fell in love with him. Lin Danny had disappeared from their lives, but none of them had forgotten her, especially Wen Yuan. As a woman, she couldn't pretend that it hadn't happened, especially when it was a woman who had such a huge impact on her feelings. It was just that none of them mentioned it again. Those wounds were just hidden. After buying the things, he carried them and walked in front, with Wen Yuan following behind. Her hand gently stroked the bracelet on her wrist. It felt a little surreal. Was this considered a betrothal gift? Even though they were married, there was no ceremony or anything. They just lived together naturally. She was a little dazed. He stopped again, and she bumped right into his back. Wen Yuan let out a soft moan. Then, his shoulders were hugged and he half carried her into the elevator. There was someone in the elevator, and it was someone he knew. Lin Shui and her agent. When she saw Yi Mubai and Wen Yuan, Lin Shui was surprised at first, but then her face quickly turned cold. Yi Mubai pretended not to see her and treated her like air. Wen Yuan, on the other hand, felt a little uneasy. At this time, Lin Shui could not hold it in any longer. The moment she opened her mouth, she mocked, "Mubai, I thought I would lose to Lin Danny. I didn't expect it to be her." Yi Mubai lowered his eyes and looked at Lin Shui coldly. Lin Shui's manager tugged at her and signaled her to stop talking. Although they were dumped, they couldn't afford to offend Yi Mubai and the Yi family. No matter how stupid Lin Shui was, she would still understand, but she couldn't swallow this insult. She still sneered, "Wen Yuan, do you know, Lin Danny or I are just Lin Cici's substitute. Yi Mubai has always liked Lin Cici. Even if you have 10 children with him, it's useless. Are you done?" Yi Mubai said coldly and pressed the button for the elevator. When it stopped on the next floor, he picked Lin Shui up and threw her out. His rudeness surprised Wen Yuan. He looked at her, his voice still mocking, "Where are the tricks you used to coax me and the tricks you used to deal with me? Or are you pretending to be weak now?" Wen Yuan bit his lower lip. "You think too much." What should she say? Lin Shui was his ex-girlfriend. Was it wrong for her not to quarrel with him? Yi Mubai glanced at her and didn't say anything else. When the elevator reached the first floor, he put the things in the trunk. When he got in the car, he looked at the time and said to Wen Yuan, "Wen Yuan, whether it's Lin Shui or Lin Danny, it has nothing to do with me. You are Mrs. Yi, remember?" Wen Yuan looked down. "I thought you didn't want me to cause trouble. After all, our relationship," she paused for a moment and smiled at him. "It is indeed controversial." Yi Mubai reached out his hand and gently touched her lips. His voice was hoarse. "This is you, Wen Yuan, isn't it?" End of this chapter. Recommend the Urban God Shinshu. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.